This module is on probability and statistics, which is often called chance and data. Probability and statistics are usually grouped together because they're often tied together in terms of representing probability through various forms of statistics. So in the early years, when we're looking at probability, there are a number of key areas that we're looking at fostering children's understanding around. One is the notion of fairness, and the other one is of chance. And these two concepts are foundational to the notion of probability. So when we're developing these notions, what we're really looking at in the early years is just developing the language and the concept, because as we've discussed earlier on, concepts and language are intimately linked. And the words that we're looking for are things like likely and unlikely. Is it likely that if you had a bag of marbles and there's 20 marbles in there and there's one red marble, is it likely or unlikely that you would pull the red marble out because there's one red marble and 19, say, blue marbles? So it's this idea of likely, unlikely. The other words that we are likely to use, pardon the pun, are something won't happen, it might happen, it could happen, or it will happen. So if we've had, if it's summer in Queensland, for example, probably Victoria is probably, or Tasmania is not a good example to use, but in Queensland and the northern parts of Australia, the weather is relatively consistent. So if we've had 4 days of sunshine, we might start to say to the kids, well, what might it be like tomorrow? Will it be sunny? Won't it be sunny? And so on. So there's sort of developing predictions about an event occurring based on previous information. So that's what we're looking at when we're developing the early notions of probability. So we're looking at the potential or the probability of an event likely to occur. So we're doing predictive forecasting, and what we're doing mainly in our probability strand is developing the language about events, like the event occurring and the events not occurring, and also whether something is fair or not. So if we had an event such as the pulling the marbles out of the red bag, and we won't say this with the children, of course, we know that there's only a 1 in 20 chance of pulling that red marble out. Is that fair that one child can have a red marble and another child can have a blue marble? So what we're doing in that process is talking also about the probability of something happening, but is that a fair chance that somebody will get a red marble and somebody would get a blue marble, and bringing in those notions of fairness around it. What we do need to do in the terms of teaching of probability is provide lots of concrete experiences where children are able to develop the conceptual understandings about probability or chance, but also the language. So again, as we discussed earlier in the course, language becomes very important in terms of developing concepts and understandings. The other part of this strand is the statistics component of it. We live in a data-drenched world. The internet is all around us. If you have a look in the newspaper, there are statistics absolutely everywhere. We do know that the effect of learning and teaching mathematics in schools has been, we've disempowered a significant percentage of the population. In all probability, that's not very fair. But what we do know is that when it comes to a lot of statistics, people are very disempowered. You will see things in newspapers, for example, that the average, and the key word here is average, the average price of houses has gone up by $100,000. But we do know, we should know, with our own understandings of statistics from maybe grade 10, year 10, is that there's different measures of central tendency. So statistics can be used to represent facts, or statistics can be used to tell us lies. You know, the old story, lies, lies and statistics. People can be seduced by mathematics because they have been disempowered by it. What we do know now and we put a lot more emphasis on it, is that statistics must be understood much more effectively than they have been. So statistics now is taking a much bigger role in the mathematics curriculum because it is part of everyday life like it hasn't been in the past. In terms of the early years, what would we be doing in statistics? Well, we're certainly not going to be teaching formal statistics. What we will be doing, and it comes back to the earlier work that we did on literacy, numeracy and graphacy. So in the early years, we'll be doing a lot of graphacy. And one of the main things that you will be doing is doing a lot of representation of data through picture graphs. And picture graphs are really important because you can have, for example, photos of every child in your classroom, and you can create different representations or different graphs of those children. You can create graphs on how many boys there are and how many girls there are. One of the things that is really critical when teaching this component of the curriculum is that when you do this work, it's best to start off with things that are squares, so that if you're using photos of the children or representations of the children, make sure they're squares so it doesn't really matter what orientation they go on, and then they're able to do direct comparisons. If you use rectangles, for example, some might put them in portrait orientation as opposed to landscape, and then it gets a bit messy because you can't do a direct comparison between the different columns or bars on your graph. So start off with squares, and then it doesn't matter if they put them one in one direction or another. What we then do is, after you've done maybe boys, you can group them by, and this comes back to your earlier work that you've been doing with number, where you've been classifying or grouping, sorting, whatever you want to call that. But again, we're going to do the same in our statistics. So now we're starting to see connections happening across the curriculum. Things that happen in one strand are going to be applied and used in another strand. So you might group them by their hair colour, the colour of their jumper, any other attributes that you or the children, and it's important to get the children to have input, but you can organise each day or each week a different representation of the students in your class. What that process does, it shows the students that we can represent information in different ways according to what we need. So we might need to know when all their birthdays are, because we might be having birthday cakes, or we might be doing something when there's birthdays, and we might see what's the most common month for children to be born in, or who are born in the most months. So what it actually means is, through doing picture graphs, the children actually see the features which the graphs are built on. So we're not going to label columns, we're not going to label our X and Y axes. That comes much later in the process. But at this point, in the early years, what we're doing is the kids will be able to see how people are grouped. So they can see that all the boys are in one column and all the girls are in the other. They can see that these group of children are born in January. You may need to label that one because it may not be so obvious. Or you can see that they've all got red hair, brown hair, black hair, blonde hair. So it's really actually getting the kids to see the features of those graphs. By seeing the features, what we later do is we take away the actual picture and create something a bit more abstract, and then we create the need for labelling those graphs. Rather than telling the kids what they're doing. So once we take away the very visual features and become more abstract, then the graph actually becomes more abstract itself. Also, through this process, what's actually happening is the students see that what we need is a baseline. We need to put all of our bars or columns of information from a common starting point, so that they can see that there's a baseline, which is our x-axis, and then we have another axis that comes up. So you will draw those lines, and then the kids can actually see that there's 6 children with red hair, there's 10 children with blonde hair, and so on. So they're actually able to count the squares. So again, as we become more abstract, not in these years, but as we become more abstract and we remove those characteristics, we actually now have the need to create labels on our x and y axes. But they're developing what they're actually the need for different features. So they need to know that we have a baseline. They need to know and they start to understand the principles of how to construct graphs. And finally, probably one of the poorest utilized strategies in this strand is actually using problem solving and posing questions. So once the students have created graphs, it becomes your role as the teacher to foster curiosity and deep knowledge about that graph. So you need to start posing questions about what is in that graph itself. Just don't leave the graph as a visual stimulus. Which column has more? Which column has less? Do we have more? Which month are most of the kids born in? Which do we have more boys? Do we have more girls? Those kind of questions. Which one is two more? Can you see one that is two more than the other? So really starting to pose deep questions about those graphs.